So thank you very much again to Margaret and Bob for inviting me. I'm really glad to have the chance to talk to everybody about these issues, particularly because it comes at a very timely moment for researchers in the United States. And I'll be talking about that in addition to my research in China, hopefully giving everybody a cross-cultural and transnational perspective on some of these issues that are affecting you here in the UK and Europe. So what I'd like to focus on today is to talk about two different aspects of this project. First, thinking about human subjects review in the United States, and then providing some ethnographic examples from the research that I have done in China. And just to give you a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Washington University, which is located in St. Louis in the middle of the landlocked country. So it's been very nice to come to Brighton and to see the sea for the first time in several months. And I received my PhD in medical and social anthropology from Harvard University. But I've conducted ethnographic research on the Chinese healthcare system since 2004, looking first at experimental stem cell and fetal cell therapies, where I got a chance to meet Margaret and a lot of the collaborators in the BioNet research collaboration. And then more recently, I just came back from a year of ethnographic fieldwork in Beijing, where I was studying end-of-life care in critical care settings and emergency rooms and ICUs in China. So that's where I'll be coming from in today's presentation. And the broader points that I'd like to make for you today about human subjects and ethical review is thinking about the way that it's been practiced in both the United States and China. There's very much been a bureaucratization of ethics that is in some cases short-circuiting some of those important conversations about what really matters to participants in these research projects, what's really at stake for them, and the actual moral dilemmas that we face in the field. So I'd like to bring that out both in terms of what's going on in the US as well as in China. And I also want to talk a little bit about how this has actually been creating new opportunities for researchers elsewhere to take norms that are established in one context and then either adopt or exploit or even challenge them in another context. So hopefully there'll be lots of food for discussion in these examples. So turning first, just to give you a quick overview of what's going on in the US, I really appreciated this morning's presentation, very much spot on, thinking about, Ron, the difference between governance and ethics, which has been a huge problem in the US, and then very specifically the way Adam pointed out that in the United States, we're very much tied up with institutional review boards. So I want to give everybody in the room just a brief look at what this is actually like for an American researcher, just to give you some comparative examples, because as I realized, the topics that we're talking about and the entities that we're talking about are not necessarily commensurable. And so thinking about, well, what is ethics review, what does it look like in the US? So in the US federal policy for the protection of human subjects is known both formally and informally as the Common Rule. And this was established in 1991. And it's a set of baseline rules that govern biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. And so any government-funded research involving human subjects in the United States must follow these rules. And nearly all US academic institutions hold their researchers to these guidelines regardless of the funding that we receive. So even if you're not on a federal grant, because of the way that the university is structured, they still essentially make everybody go through this process, from undergraduates doing senior thesis research all the way to postdoctoral researchers as well as university faculty. So it's all going through a single committee at the university who evaluates projects in all disciplines. And so the requirements basically stipulate that institutions have to assure compliance for researchers to obtain and document informed consent. And this is implemented through the establishment of institutional review boards to oversee human research. As Adam pointed out this morning, this is done at the institutional level. And so the review doesn't take place at federal or state or national. It's very much localized depending on where you're based. And so there's additional protections that have been put in place for certain vulnerable research populations, from pregnant women to fetuses, prisoners, and children. So these are all been added on. to the regulations. And they're essentially based on the 1979 Belmont report, the one in the US that specified the 3 basic ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and then apply these specifically to mean in the areas of informed consent, the assessment of risks and benefits, and the selection of research subjects. So as you can tell, it's very much a procedural focus on how you recruit subjects and the ways in which you ensure that the process and the procedure is correct. And then after that, you're basically let loose and the research proceeds. And so the reason why it's particularly timely for us right now, and when Margaret and Bob told me that you were hosting this symposium, I thought that maybe there's a similar event happening in the UK right now. But essentially, the first major overhaul of the Common Rule is being conducted right now in the US. So on September 8th of this year, the US government published its long-awaited proposal for a really dramatic overhaul of the federal regulations for the protection of human subjects. And it's a pretty overwhelming document. This is just the cover and one of the pages. It's 131 pages of text that looks like that they've invited the public, which is us, to comment on. And so what happens is that the comment period is open until December 7th, and anybody can put forth a comment or a critique or a question to the policymakers. And after that period closes, then the administrators will begin the multi-year process of actually finalizing the new rules. So it's really an amazing opportunity to at least try to intervene, particularly for anthropologists, in this process. Because what prompted this ethics overhaul in the US is that there's a widespread recognition among basically every single quarter that the current system has not been functioning as intended. And so it's resulted in burdensome oversight efforts that do not actually produce better outcomes for research participants. Particularly, the workload of IRBs has expanded so much that they can't really focus adequate attention on the kinds of higher risk research that originally motivated the creation of human subjects protection. So thinking back, for example, they cite in the Belmont report thinking about Nuremberg, thinking about Nazi experimentation, thinking about in the US, the Tuskegee syphilis study. And so these were all impetuses for establishing ethical review in the US. But instead, what they end up dithering about is thinking about anthropological projects, thinking about survey research, and so a lot of their time and attention is taken up with this. And so in this new proposal, the federal regulators have diagnosed the problem as because of ballooning volume and diversity of research. So they're really blaming it on the fact that there's more and more research being done. But a lot of critics have argued that it's actually because of the vague and overgeneralized regulatory definitions that have been applied in a very adversarial environment, which is causing a lot of what people have called the mission creep of IRBs, those institutional review boards. So the current regulatory mandate is so poorly defined that the scope has come to include, in effect, all research with human beings. And so, as Adam pointed out, there's a huge conflict of interest for local institutional review boards, right? It's very caution-driven, so risk-averse, really trying to limit the liability of the institution. They don't want to get sued by angry patients, and so a lot of the institutional mechanisms are designed to protect these universities. And also, they're worried about not passing muster with the federal auditors, so that often encourages them to opt for full review when essentially maybe an expedited process by a few people could have solved some of these issues. And so the existing regulations lack some kind of principled rationale. And just to give you an example of what this looks like, at Washington University, my home institution, we have one of the top research-based medical schools in the country. It consistently ranks in U.S. News and World Report at number 3 or 4 in the country. And so not surprisingly, the medical school really dominates the agenda of the IRB. And so the review board is based at the medical school. It's comprised of 180 members, most of them which come from the medical school faculty and community. And so in 2014, the Washington University IRB received 15,240 144 applications. Amazingly, 12,000 of them were expedited by 6 staff members, and the rest, the 2,000 plus, required full board meetings, which is still quite an agenda if you think about what they have to get through. In the previous system, they would meet about once or twice a week, review 15 to 18 or 15 to 20 studies, and they required 15 to 18 members of the IRB to be present. So it was quite a bureaucratic undertaking, and they've actually moved that to 6 meetings per week now, meeting more regularly, but shorter meetings that review fewer numbers of studies. And so they've actually been able to review more proposals to expedite the process for more people. But the application itself involves 12 separate sections with over 100 questions that each researcher who's applying has to answer. And they range from detailed questions about your project. You have to specify, of course, your research questions, hypothesis, the significance of your project. These are all things that they're judging us on, even though they're people who have perhaps no disciplinary training in your field, in most fields of study that they're reviewing. Also, particularly, they're interested in your participants. And so this, for me, included 41 separate questions for my inclusion, exclusion criteria, whether or not the disease or condition under study was represented equally throughout the US population, even though I was studying patients and doctors in China, all sorts of questions that really don't apply but still have to be answered because of federal mandates. So you can see what the workload looks like from an American researcher perspective, particularly an anthropologist who does research abroad. And so another 40 plus questions on my recruitment and consent process. And so as you can see, one major critique that American anthropologists have had is that there's very much a procedural focus that's based on this biomedical research model, and the emphasis on subject selection, recruitment, obtaining of consent really neglects some of the more important ethical issues, including, for example, local, regional, social, and political hierarchies and tensions. In the Chinese case, they really much see these medical decisions as being made between patients and doctors, an individual dyad. But then in China, it's very much based on family-made decisions, and that's really, there's no mechanism for recognizing that in the informed consent process. They also, there's no way to take into account the rising tensions between the medical staff and patients and families, and so there's been, Margaret has written about this, the rising tension and rates of violence actually physically targeting doctors. And so these are sort of the issues that are really at the forefront of people's minds in China that completely get left off of these forms in terms of the way the review processes. And the second major critique that people have had is that all of this diverse research being carried out at the university is really channeled through this single committee with a very provincial focus, right? Very much focused on US-based medical research. So when I was doing my review, they fixated on the question that I needed to provide a toll-free US number to my informants in case some kind of adverse reaction happened when I was asking questions to them so they can complain about me. And I pointed out the fact that people in China can't even make a toll-free US number because that number just has no meaning in China. And so that took about 10 emails back and forth before they finally acknowledged that was the case. But it's getting to this level of micromanagement and nitpickiness, and you wonder why their workload has increased so that they can't really effectively review. So clearly the system is broken, and they're really trying to take steps to mitigate this. But the question is, what is going on then in the review process? And just really quickly, at this regulatory ethics versus research ethics, really getting at what Ron identified with research and governance issues, you can really tell that the regulatory ethics that we're expected to comply with as a condition of funding or employment really doesn't match up with the actual issues, the moral dilemmas we face on the ground, and the responsibilities that we have to the research participants. And so with these new rules, this notice of proposed rulemaking, the new common rule that's being proposed, is that what they're trying to do is create procedures for appropriate exemption determinations in a manner that, quote, does not waste time and effort. So they're trying to create new categories of exemption from IRB review. And so what they've basically tried to do is say that essentially the IRB is only going to focus on those physical risks with the more biomedical research, the ones that actually have physical interventions on human bodies. And so that sounds all very well and great. Okay, they're going to focus their attention on these kind of studies. But what's actually happened is that then there's a second corollary to this revision where they say that every other type of research is now classified as an informational risk. And the informational risk kind of studies, so sociology, anthropology, psychology, economics, all of these other disciplines, what we're going to be subject to is instead mandatory regulatory protections of data security, information protection, and consent requirements. So getting back to what Peter was talking about with data management. And these are going to be modeled after the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which was a 2003 regulation that was put into place in the US. It was a privacy rule as part of this to establish a new category of protected health information. So any information in the medical record that can be used to identify an individual that was created and disclosed in the course of providing healthcare service was considered protected, and you couldn't disclose that without obtaining written consent from the participant specifying what you were going to use it for. And so now the federal government is proposing to apply this model to every kind of research, not necessarily in the health realm. So you can see that on the one hand, they're trying to solve the problem, but in fact, perpetuating some of the very problems that existed in the first place of maintaining this biomedical model and thinking about things in terms of risk and trying to then, how do we avert those risks or completely avoid them altogether? And it'll still be done through the institutional processes and mechanisms to ensure that. So we do have an opportunity to comment and to try to change the course of these decisions. And I think that Ron's proposal, thinking about, well, why channel everything through this one system? Are there multiple ways that we can provide to then have different standards? And so sociologists and anthropologists have banded together to try to create a new set of mechanisms, but it remains to be seen how well this will be taken up by these federal agencies. So I just wanted to give you, this background so that you can, when we talk more comparatively in terms of transnational research, if you're working with any American collaborators, this is the field that we're dealing with currently. It's very much in flux, but it's looking a little bit nerve-wracking at the moment. In terms of thinking about what's going on in China, just to give you another point of comparison, how does this affect transnational research and collaboration abroad? And so what I want to do is provide some ethnographic examples from my own research. So the first project that I actually just submitted my book revisions to the publisher on, I looked at fetal cell therapies for neurodegenerative disorders. 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork focused on neurosurgeon Huang Hongyun's clinical enterprise and the thousands of patients from over 70 countries who were attracted to China to undergo these very experimental and controversial therapies. And Margaret just told me that you have invited him to Sussex, I think last year, to talk about his research. And so I'm really curious for those of you who were able to attend the kind of conversations that you had. But my book looks at some of the dilemmas and practices that were associated with these transnational medical treatments. And then more recently, I've been working on end-of-life care, just spending 1 year in Beijing, conducting fieldwork on hospital staff members, patients, and their families as they negotiate treatment decisions in the emergency room and an intensive care unit in the context of a shrinking family size and crisis in filial piety, thinking about the increasing dissatisfaction against healthcare workers and how in this context do medical decisions about end-of-life care get made. And so, given this kind of context, what exactly is going on with ethical review in China? And of course, Margaret and Bob have extensive experience establishing these kinds of international research collaborations and also examining some of the ethical challenges that are implicit in that kind of transaction. My purpose today is just to provide some more examples that we might be able to talk about in thinking about this field. And so what's the context that we're facing? There's been increasingly active discussions about ethical review for human subjects research in China. And much of this is actually stemming from partnerships and collaborations and conversations with European and North American researchers who want to collaborate with Chinese scholars, partly because you think about 1.3 billion people, that's a huge market, there's huge opportunities for study. So it's a lot of interest both in the industry and academia for these collaborations. And so oftentimes, they often require oversight and approval from funding agencies and local institutions before their home institutions will grant approval of research that takes place off-site or abroad. So in my case, for example, Washington University wanted me to have IRB approval from the Chinese institution before they would sign off on my project, ensuring that there's some kind of oversight abroad. But of course, these kinds of institutions are essentially creating these rubber stamp review processes that are often created in China to satisfy the requirements of their foreign collaborators. And so the result is a very rapid development of research systems and regulatory apparatuses that have expediency as a key value. How can we approve the research quickly so that we can then expedite these collaborations? And so, like the US, it's not surprisingly dominated by a biomedical research model because that's where most of the lucrative collaborations are. And so there's increasing numbers of pharmaceutical company, industry clinical trials with contract research organizations that have set up shop. And so a lot of what they're trying to do is expedite those kinds of translatable research that then can be taken up by US regulators to approve that kind of study. And so much of the discussion about ethical review is focused on the clinical context, leading to the establishment of medical ethics review committees. And so specifically thinking about it in that context. And so human subjects research is translated literally as 人类受实研究, so literally receiving or being a subject to a test or experiment, and is understood in that kind of context. So anthropological research really does not fit this model very well at all. And so oftentimes when an anthropologist will ask for, well, how can I get approval from you to do my study? They said, this is not really even research, right? It doesn't really even count as what they recognize. And so in that case, oftentimes it's done through your personal connections. They say, well, we'll just run it through anyway, but you don't really need this review because you're not really injecting that green stuff, right? You're not really doing any of the stuff that we recognize as human subjects research. So partly with anthropology, it's not been so much of a problem per se, but again, it's not really reviewing those very real ethical dilemmas that you might face in terms of interacting in the field. And again, that process short circuits the actual conversations that you might have about moral dilemmas in the field. Another impetus that Adam also mentioned in the UK context is the flawed reward system that is really leading to a lot of academic fraud that's happening in China. So appointments, promotions, pay bonuses, grants are all decided on the basis of the number of publications that a Chinese researcher produces. And so those indexed in prestigious SCI, Science Citation Index, journals with high impact factors are particularly rewarded. And so this has become a requirement even for students to graduate at a growing number of doctoral programs. And so not surprisingly, this has led to a lot of pressure to publish, to expedite your research processes. And so the publications, of course, also require assurances about ethical review. So again, expediting that review process to get those publications out there. And so China has been rife with some major scandals regarding scientific misconduct, everything from plagiarism to fabrication to outright falsification of data. And so articles have been retracted, credentials have been faked. There's even a huge academic black market thriving where researchers can buy English editing services or even entire papers. You can even buy authorship depending on how much you're willing to pay. And editors are taking bribes to ensure the publication of certain papers. And so we have this very controversial and problematic environment, whereas there's this very much expediting research and really not having very good systems in place to ensure, even proper research conduct or ethical procedures has completely taken a backside in terms of those kinds of at least regulatory processes. Now, of course, it happens more individually when you have conversations and thinking about it, but it's very much on individual research basis as opposed to having some kind of framework for thinking about these issues. And so that's been a very difficult context, I think, for people who are trying to do legitimate research in China. And I have to say that in all of my research projects that I've been collaborating with Chinese colleagues, I've actually never once seen them personally engage in academic fraud. So it is rife, but most, I would say, at least the people that I've encountered, people working, I've been mostly based in Beijing, in urban, top tertiary care medical research facilities. So I think that there's very much a recognition of this. And so because of that, we can see some of the challenges that are facing transnational research collaborations. But thank you very much, and I'd be happy to talk about more specifically the research examples during the question and answer.